Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming out this evening to attend a webinar, Majestic Banff, Yoho, Jasper, and the Icefields Parkway, a photographic journey through the Canadian Rockies. So for the next hour or so, we'll take you on a hopefully enjoyable tour through an unbelievably picturesque and beautiful part of the world. We are in webinar mode, so I can't see you. My wife is here as co-host, so she's going to kind of pay attention to any Q&A or chat. So I've got about 6 different sections in the presentation. I'll try and remember and stop at the end of each section before I go on to address a couple of questions if people have stuff that's pertinent to that particular section. And then we'll go on, and I do have a slide at the end for overall questions. So with that, I know a lot of times people drop in where they're coming from, and wow. So we have people from Texas, New York, Michigan, New Jersey. Hello, New Jersey. Massachusetts, of course. Somebody asked about John Brown. Yes, we'll talk about John Brown at the end. That is my next presentation in January. So wow, Lunenburg, West Chicago, Portland, Oregon, Long Island, Virginia, DC. Great. Great to see people from all over the country. We're going to a different country. And like I said before, it is a magical and beautiful place, which hopefully some of my photographs are able to convey. And with that, we'll get started. And my clicker would work. That would really help things. There we go. So a lot of times, Banff is kind of the national park that most people associate with the Canadian Rockies. And, you know, when you have a conversation about Banff, usually the question goes one of two ways. One is, what word are you trying to say? Or, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful place. So I've been asked, like, why Banff? And the interesting thing is, when I was a kid, there was a thing called a Viewmaster, which I think people who are of a certain age are familiar with that. They would have these little circular things you would put in. It would give you an image in 3D. And so the Viewmaster I got in the early 70s, the starter reel was famous world scenes. And one of those scenes was the Bow Valley from Banff, Canada. So that has been in the back of my mind for 50 plus years. And oddly or disappointingly enough, I have actually never gone to any of these other ones, Mount Fuji, the Matterhorn, Panama Canal, but I finally did make it to the Bow Valley and to Banff. So that kind of was, I said, percolating around in my mind for years. And fortunately, this summer we were able to make it a reality. So as far as an agenda goes, we will talk about some background, both from a geography and historical perspective of the area. Then we'll launch into Banff, Yoho, and we'll do the Icefields Parkway, which basically goes through Banff and Jasper, going north. We'll end up in Jasper, which is a northern part of the Canadian Rockies. And then we'll do a little bit of a exploration and some art in the Canadian Rockies and a wrap up. So with that, we will lay the foundation. So I think for folks who have seen some of my presentations before, a lot of times we end up in the Ice Age. And particularly for those of us in the Northeast, the last ice age, the Laurentide sheet, about 12 or 14,000 years ago, has a lot to do with the landscape that we deal with. So you can see it basically went as far south as right at the edge of Pennsylvania, through here in the upper Midwest, and then through the very, very northern parts of the United States. And it does go into here, into Canada. So the Laurentide sheet is here. The Cordilleran sheet is over here on the west, and kind of where they meet is where the Rocky Mountains kind of formed. And they weren't formed by the glacier, but the glacier does have a real impact on the topography because, and I'd never been to the American Rockies, but because the Canadian Rockies were under the glacier and the American Rockies were not, they actually are different. The American Rockies were mostly carved out by rivers, where a lot of the Canadian Rockies is sculpted by glaciers. So it actually has a more jagged, peaked appearance, and the valleys are more U-shaped, where in the American Rockies, they're a little bit softer and the valleys are more V-shaped. So, once again, a lot of times you find out that you look at the landscape that we're dealing with, and in the not too distant past, you find out that what has happened, particularly with glaciers, has really, really impacted. And here in New England, we have that all over the place. A lot of our topography in New England has a lot to do with glaciers. And you see the glaciers here extended right down to Long Island. And so a lot of what we have here, when I did my presentation a few years ago in the Hudson River Valley, that has a lot to do, and it was formed by the glaciers. And so were the Canadian Rockies. So as far as the kind of cultural development of Canada in general and the Rockies, and you find this out with a lot of really the colonial settling of North America has a lot to do with the fur trade. So the fur trade was basically driven by two companies in Canada. One was Hudson's Bay Company, and one was the Northwest Company. And so the Hudson's Bay Company is pretty famous. I think most people have heard of it, heard of Hudson's Bay blankets. And you can see that a lot of what happened with Canada, all these different districts that were divvied up because of fur trade, have a lot to do with the initial kind of European influx into the Canadians. And the First Nations, which is the Canadian referencing to the Indigenous people, they were heavily involved in the fur trade as well. And a lot of it had to do with the Hudson Bay Basin. A lot of rivers extend off the Hudson Bay, and so that's obviously was the pathways, railroads, transportation mechanism in the day was rivers and bodies of water. So the Hudson Bay was a very, very strategic place in this, and a lot of these districts came up because of that. Interesting thing about Hudson Bay Company is we were in Montreal actually for Thanksgiving last year, and Hudson Bay is like Macy's. It's a very big department store. There's a huge one in downtown Montreal, beautiful store, not cheap. When I was doing the research for this presentation, I wasn't aware that the Hudson Bay Company actually went bankrupt in March of this year. So this company existed from 1670 into 2025. So over 350 years, the only thing I can think would be roughly equivalent, and it's not really, would be Macy's, since Macy's started in Nantucket with R.H. Macy's in the 1800s. Once again, not nearly as old as the Hudson's Bay Company. So the Hudson Bay Company unfortunately came to an end earlier this year, and we'll talk a little bit about the company that took over its intellectual property, since that plays into our story a little bit later. Canadian history is fascinating. As somebody who has lived pretty much, well, actually all of my adult life within a couple of hours of the Canadian border, I am woefully ignorant in Canadian history, but as I start to travel and explore Canada a little bit more, I find out some fascinating things. Here in Western Canada, it's actually kind of interesting because Canada becomes a dominion in 1867, I believe. And so the Independence Day for Canada is July 1st, 1867. And we were actually in the Rockies this year on July 4th. Saw tons of people walking around with proudly displaying their Canadian flags. But it actually doesn't, it's still actually a dominion of the UK and doesn't really become a totally separate independent country until like 1932. But they do celebrate 1867 as their kind of Independence Day. However, that really is only this part of Canada. Basically, the eastern part of Canada, what we know today is Nova Scotia, Quebec, and Ontario. So we were out here around the border of Alberta and British Columbia. And the interesting thing is British Columbia comes into the Dominion in 1871 and kind of references some of the discussions we've had in current day. There was a lot of talk about British Columbia actually becoming a state because in 1867, the United States buys Alaska from Russia. So you had the United States up here in the north, you had the United States down here to the south. Would make kind of sense that this may become a state. So it doesn't go that way. It goes that it becomes a province, but the reason it becomes a province is British Columbia wants to be connected to the eastern. This is, where all the stuff is happening. You have Montreal, you have Toronto, this is where all the stuff is happening in Canada. They don't want to be this outlier out here in the west. So one of the major stipulations is they have to build a transcontinental railroad. So they build a transcontinental railroad basically from Vancouver all the way to Montreal. And in my sources at the end, I will reference a book that goes through that whole construction, and it's an engineering marvel. It was incredibly complex. It was incredibly dangerous. It was incredibly challenging from an engineering perspective because you are going through these Canadian Rockies, which are not a great place to build a railroad, but they do complete it in 1885. And the reason I kind of talk about all this within reference to the Canadian Rockies is this was one of the major driving factors for the creation of the national parks because they were created as a destination for travelers from the east. So all this kind of connects in as to why British Columbia is actually a province of Canada and why we have the railroad going across the country and the fact that you have these parks built out here as a destination to bring, this is where all the population center is here in Eastern Canada, and bring them out west here. So that's kind of why we're in the Canadian Rockies. And to this day, you didn't have to go very far as we're walking around Banff, Jasper. There are certainly a lot of freight trains in existence, and you see these all over the place. Used a couple of pictures there, but the railroad is alive and living and alive and well out in Western Canada, and obviously you have a lot of transportation of goods between those two areas of the country. So it's something that still is very, very active. There's a very famous passenger called the Rocky Mountaineer, which goes from Vancouver out to Jasper. So a lot of activity in the railroads out in Western Canada. And another thing that gets constructed, this is the Banff Springs Hotels. Fairmont owns it today. There are a couple of luxurious hotels out this way. There's this Fairmont Banff Springs. There's a Chateau Lake Louise. There's a Jasper Park Lodge, which is Fairmont. Actually, I guess even the Chateau Frontenac, which is in Quebec City, that is a Fairmont. These are constructed to, once again, encourage wealthy travelers to come out this way. So you have these incredibly elaborate and ornate places in a very, very wilderness area. And, we were there at the end of June, early July. Some of the roads had just cleared from snow a couple of weeks ago, a couple of weeks prior to that. So, most of Canada outside of the, kind of Vancouver area, winter is a very, very serious business. And it is out there too. I mean, they get a lot of snow out there, some very, very significant cold, but they have these absolutely luxurious lodges. And certainly Banff Springs is one of them. And then on top of that, actually, after the railroad, as the car becomes more prevalent in the 1900s, you have the Trans-Canada Highway. And when you go from Calgary, which is where you fly into, to Banff, you're on the Trans-Canada Highway. So once again, this whole transportation thing of kind of connecting Canada, as you see, most of the population of Canada is within, I think, 100 or 200 miles of the U.S. border, but you have both the train and the highway going this way in southern Canada, connecting this way from all the way from St. John's in Newfoundland all the way to Victoria here in the west. So once again, this is kind of where we are. The Jasper and Banff are in Alberta, and we're going to go into Yoho a little bit here, which is actually in British Columbia, which is where the time zone changes. This is Mountain Time Zone, and this one goes into Western Time Zone. We spent most of our time in Banff and Jasper, just one day in Yoho. And you do fly into Calgary. For those of us in Boston, you can fly nonstop from Logan to Calgary via WestJet, which is a Canadian airline. They're partnered with Delta. So you can do it. I will say WestJet does not have a large presence in Logan. The people who check your luggage are also about an hour later, the people who are at the gate shepherding you down the plane. Kind of interesting, once you fly into Calgary, WestJet is everywhere. So they don't have a prime spot in Logan. Actually, our flight was delayed, and I think part of that was the fact I don't think WestJet really has that many flights out of Logan. But it's about, I think it was a 5-hour flight. Going west is about 5.5 hours. Going back, it was about 4.5 hours. Sorry, 4.5 to 5 hours with the jet stream. But, nonstop, pretty nice. And so you can fly right from Boston to Calgary. And then Calgary is about an hour and a half from Banff over the Trans-Canada Highway. So it's pretty easy to get to for those of us in eastern Massachusetts. This is as close as we got to Calgary, unfortunately. It's a pretty big city, over 1 million people. We were there a few days before the Calgary Stampede, which I wish we couldn't stay because of logistical reasons, other things we had to do to get back home. But that sounds like a phenomenal thing. And like I said, certainly a very modern city. Would not want to be there in February, but the closest we got was the airport hotel that we stayed in. We did get in pretty late the first night, so we stayed at a hotel right at the airport and then drove to Banff the next morning. And speaking of that, Banff was the first national park. So it was created in 1885, which is the year that the Transcontinental Railroad is completed. There's actually a tie-in there because Banff is the first national park. As you find out with a lot of recreational areas, it's built around springs. These springs were basically promoted by railroad workers. And so there's a big mural actually in downtown Banff here. It says the Banff Cave Basin. It's the first national park, birthplace of Canada's national parks. Banff is that. We'll see here, we stayed in Canmore, which is a nice town that's about a half hour outside of Banff. And then Banff is in the park, and Lake Louise, the other famous iconic location within Banff. So most of our travels were kind of up this way. And for whatever reason, the time we were there, they basically suspended all fees in the national parks in Canada. So it's about $60, I think, in order for a carload for a week. But that was free. So we were able to get into those national parks for free. As far as weather goes, like I said, it's a serious place for winter. There's no doubt. I was checking the weather last year in Edmonton, which is more toward Jasper, but it got to 40 below zero last winter in Edmonton. And the interesting thing about that is a temperature where Celsius and Fahrenheit meet. So 40 degrees below zero is 40 degrees below zero, at least on those two scales, how you slice it. Super cold. So we were there around here. I mean, we were not this is around 70 degrees. I think it was between, depends on the day. If it was rainy, it was around in the 50s. If it was sunny, it was in the 60s. It was perfect hiking weather. We did do a lot of hikes, and we'll get into that as we go through the program. But you see, when you get into the winter here in January and in December, you're talking about highs well below freezing and lows getting close to zero. So once again, winter is the longest season, and it is a very, very serious winter there. But it's a relatively short season. As one of these places we'll talk about, the roads are really open only from like mid to late June until mid-October. So it's a small window to get some of these places. And my daughter who went with us was checking some of the roads before we went. And I said within a couple of weeks before we were going to leave, some of the roads are still closed from snow. So it's there. But one of the things about this whole area is, I mean, it's right there. You don't have to drive a long way. These pictures were taken in downtown Banff. So this is the main drag in downtown Banff. As you can see, these jagged snow-capped mountains are right there. This is a barbecue truck right in downtown Banff, and you see behind it there are these unbelievable vistas right here. So, when you turn and look everywhere, you don't have to like drive way off to see one particular mountain. You're seeing all these vistas right there and right in town. So there's not a long way to go to get in some incredible shots. And as I mentioned, the origin of Banff was a hot springs, and they still have that preserved to a certain degree today. It's not nearly as big as it was before. You can't go into these hot springs. I'm not sure if there's other ones you can. There are some other hot springs around some of these national parks. The one in and around Banff, I don't think you can still go into them. However, the hot spring is still a thing. And so unfortunately, we had some problems sharing the sound. So none of these videos you'll see will have sound. They're not a huge issue. This is just you hear some voices of people in the background, but you can see this is, the spring is still bubbling up today. So there still is, geothermal activity happening in this area, but that was the genesis for why Banff is where it is. And as far as the name goes, a lot of Scottish people were selling this area and being partly of Scottish extraction. I found that kind of interesting. I didn't really realize that. But Banff refers to, there is some location in Scotland that has Banff in the name, and that's where they got the name Banff, because it is kind of a different name, but that's why they named it Banff. And there we find a lot of different references to Scottish immigrants who immigrated to Canada. Like a lot of them worked on the railroad, and a lot of them did end up in Western Canada, but Banff does reference back to a location in Scotland. And as I mentioned, we are going to talk a bit about hikes, and I'm going to show a kind of a composite of waterfalls. There are a lot of waterfalls. I had been to Iceland the summer before. I don't want to compare the two. Iceland definitely has better waterfalls. That being said, there were amazing waterfalls in Banff as well, but we did a lot of hikes. And to get some of these vistas, you do have to do some hiking. And I will say, from a crowd perspective, we were there at the high tourist season, so a lot of these places were really crowded. But what we found out is once you do some, even these are not exorbitant hikes. I mean, they're not simple hikes either. They're kind of in the easy to moderate range. But once you start doing any kind of hikes, the crowds really thin out. So that became kind of a motivation for us as well. I mean, there was we see some amazing vistas, and you kind of get away from the crowds. But this one we got right into it, and once again, kind of on the theme that these things are very close. This is Tunnel Mountain Hike, and this map, this is downtown Banff. So this is the town of Banff right here. We literally parked at the visitor center, kind of somewhere over in here, and then walked to the trailhead. Now, what we didn't know is there was actually another parking lot in the trailhead, and we could have saved ourselves a few hundred feet in elevation if we had done that. But be that as it may, and it was our first day there after flying the night before, so it was a bit of an aggressive hike. But you got the switchback going on, and it was, I don't know, over an hour to get up there. But as you'll see, it's worth it. So you get these kind of vistas as you go up, and we'll see a lot of these. And once again, this was our first day, and one of the kind of running jokes in the trip was, is this going to be the best view? And then you see another view, and it's like, oh my gosh, that was better than the one before. But you see a better view, and there's no shortage of this stuff. This was actually one of the better views, but we saw a ton of amazing stuff that I hope to show you as we go through this. But this is what you get as you go up Tunnel Mountain. And this is looking back the other way, the slide before was looking away from the town of Banff. Here is the Bow River, which is the river that goes around Banff. This is the town of Banff. This is my daughter. And this is looking back with, once again, a beautiful vista. And the interesting thing about beautiful vistas in Canadian national parks is they have this thing about red Adirondack chairs. So they have placed throughout the national parks in Canada about 200 pairs of Adirondack chairs in what they consider great views. And I'm sure there are people who, check off the list as many as they can. We stumbled on most of these. They did kind of coincide with, I have to give credit, my daughter is the one who planned most of these, actually all of these hikes. And we kept on coming upon amazing views. And so they have these red chairs. And once we became aware of them, it was kind of cool as you kind of turn the corner on your hike. And then you see, oh, there's a red chair. So this is the one actually a little bit behind where my daughter was standing looking back over the town of Banff. This one is up in Pyramid Mountain in Jasper. And this one is the old Fort Loop in Jasper as well. But like I said, there's 11 in Banff and 6 in Jasper. So no shortage of great vistas in these parks. And as you see, the symbol for Parks Canada is the beaver. So the beaver pelts were the prized pelts for all this fur trading. And so what happened with the fur trade was they basically drove the beaver to pretty much extinction in Europe. And then these explorers start coming over. The French are coming over. The English are coming over. Actually, my hometown, Albany, New York, was originally called Beverwyck, which is Dutch for like a beaver town. And the further north you went, because of how cold it was, the beaver pelts were thicker because they need to get more warmth because how extremely cold. You're 40 below and even colder is going to, give a very, very thick beaver pelt. So these things became very prized, extremely pricey, and it drove this trade for centuries, really, up until I think the early to mid 1800s. It went on from the 1500s really to the 1800s, over 300 years of that. So the beaver trade is a huge, huge thing that drove a lot of Europeans into Canada. So the other iconic location within Banff is Lake Louise. And as I mentioned about crowds, I think those of you who are familiar with going to some of the U.S. national parks during the summer, they're having, some challenges of being loved to death. And so they're trying different strategies to, how to manage the crowds. And Parks Canada is no different. And the Canadian Rockies are certainly one of the iconic, if not the iconic park in Canada. So with Lake Louise and Moraine Lake, they have a shuttle system. And this started just a couple of years ago. If you watch some videos on YouTube, if it's, 4 or 5 years old, it won't mention this. And then if you get one that's relatively new, there's one particular guy that we watched on it. He's a native of Calgary, I think, and he was incensed that they put this in place, but you can't really get to these places without taking a shuttle. There are some exceptions for, for handicap and stuff like that. You can buy a private tour, which will get you in. But if you want to drive your car into Lake Louise and Moraine Lake, you have to go into the shuttle system. And the shuttle system it sells out. They release like 40% of them, I know, a couple of months before. And then I think it's 48 hours before your day, they release 60% of the tickets. And it is this like, get online at 10 o'clock to 10 a.m. is the time they become available. Get online 10 a.m., 48 hours before you want to go to the lakes and try and get your tickets. And we did. My daughter had met a friend from our hometown who was out there with her family, oddly enough, at the same time, but they were doing a hike. They didn't get their tickets, but then I think my wife was able to get in a second round and people had released their tickets and we got some tickets. So there is some stress with that. I mean, there's no doubt about it. This is, a very, very popular thing. Obviously, the summer is the high season. This really is the only time you ran into this kind of thing. Lake Louise is kind of, one of the, or probably the iconic thing in the Canadian Rockies. You can make arguments that, there certainly are lakes that are as beautiful, and there's plenty of lakes, as we'll see, all over the place with amazing colors. But everybody goes there at least the first time, and you gotta kind of want to see Lake Louise. So this is kind of the challenge you have. So you do get put in here where the shuttle drops you off. You have, once again, another Fairmont property, the Chateau Lake Louise, which is one of the properties they built to encourage tourists to come here. It worked. And so you can walk around, it's flat. You can walk around Lake Louise and get some very nice vistas of Lake Louise. And we'll see some of the classic pictures of that in a second. Then you can also, and this is another theme of the talk here, hike up a little bit and get some perspective, some elevation, and maybe get a little bit different view and certainly some different pictures. So this is your classic Lake Louise picture, looking back toward the mountains and the glacier melt as it goes in, and you have your kind of aqua watercolor here, which we'll get into how that happens in a second. There are some intrepid people. They seemed like they were from Eastern Europe. They went in for a dip, albeit it seemed a bit short, which once again, this is glacial water. So you're not talking about all that much above, 32 degrees, but they were in there for, I don't know, 10 minutes or so on a relatively cloudy and cool day. So that was kind of cool. But as I mentioned, you can go up and there's this thing called the Fairview Overlook, which is not a terribly long hike. I want to say it's a half to 3/4 of a mile, but it is pretty much straight up. So there's no switchbacks. You just kind of hike straight up to an overlook, and you'll see the elevation gain here is a couple hundred feet as you go. The lake itself is at 5,700 feet, and you're close to 6,000 here. This is the ridge line there, but this is the picture you get. And once again, I mean, it's just, it's amazing. You have this incredibly beautiful color. You have, once again, you're in the mountains, you find the same thing of any mountain, certainly the White Mountains around here. You get some gray clouds. You're just going to have typically all this kind of texture. And, from a photographer's perspective, it's pretty cool. And so this is worth the hike to get up there and see this vista. It's an amazing place. And as we'll go through, both the rivers and the lakes all have these kind of greenish blue colors, some that are a little bit more intense than others. And it's created by the glacial runoff and the minerals that are in the glacial runoff. And the locals, they call it rock flour. It's also referred to as glacial flour. And so as the glacier kind of recedes and melts, these minerals and sediments come down into the water, they reflect sunlight, and you get these different colors. And I guess there are differences depending upon whether it's sunny, whether it's cloudy, also, I guess, different times of year. Basically, the time we were there is the best time for this kind of colors, which is great. So you're getting a lot of the glacial runoff as the snow season had stopped in May and June. Glaciers start to melt. You get a lot of sediment coming down. You get great, kind of suspension within the water. I'll mention a lake we come up a little bit later is Emerald Lake, and you kind of put your hand in the water, and there's a silty feel to it. So those folks who are swimming, I don't know if I would really do that, but this is what really gives you the different colors of the lake. Oddly enough, if you go into AI and give it the information and say, draw a diagram of that, you get this, which I thought was kind of funny because it's pretty simple and says, glacial rock flour causes color. So, but there you go. You have the glacier, it melts off, it goes in the river itself has color, and then it goes into these terminal lakes. And once again, you can kind of see that they will have different color because this is obviously moving water and this is more stationary water, but that gets you all the colors, and we will see plenty of that. The other one that is kind of iconic and doesn't really have as much notoriety necessarily as Lake Louise is Moraine Lake. And so that is included in the whole shuttle. So you have to kind of, take your shuttle to Lake Louise and then do a connection to Moraine Lake. Moraine Lake has, people will argue it is a prettier lake. Certainly the color is astounding. It's this more blue. And unfortunately for us, it kind of rained at that part. So there is this thing called the rock pile that you hike up that has some steps, but mostly it's all this fallen rock, and you kind of hike up here and you look down onto Moraine Lake, and there were some people kayaking, and it's absolutely stunning. And the color is just, unbelievable. I mean, this is really, really amazing. I wish we could have walked around. There's no trail here, but there was a trail here over on the other side of the lake. But as I said, once we got off the rock pile, it started raining. And that was really only the one of two times that we really were kind of impacted in our trip by the weather. So we had to kind of stay over an overhang for an hour or so as it rained fairly hard, and all the rocks get wet. You don't want to be hiking up that rock pile when it's wet, that's for sure. And that's something that helped a lot with our hikes, as we didn't have to encounter a lot of rain. But Moraine Lake is certainly an unbelievable, beautiful place, and lesser known than Lake Louise. So with that, we will transition to Yoho, and I will call on my gracious co-host, Lisa, to say any questions you see. I see some comments. People are saying I like maps. I love maps.
Yeah.
No doubt
Can
about
you hear
that.
me, Bruce? Hear me?
You're a little buzzy, but
Okay. The only question, Alice wanted to know how, if we had any recommended travel, if we wanted to cover Canada from one end to the other. So my advice would be call a travel agent. But I don't know if you have advice on that, since we actually haven't done that.
I have driven Southern Ontario. I lived very briefly out in Detroit, and I had to go from Albany to Detroit, and a quicker route was through Southern Ontario. So I have covered kind of that part. It's very flat, very grain, wheat fields, stuff like that. I mean, there are these trips. The Mountaineer is this train that goes from Vancouver. There are trains that go all across the country. That's I haven't we haven't done a lot of train trips, certainly in the United States or Canada. The thing is, it's large. I mean, you look at it, obviously, it's pretty much as wide as the United States. So it's a significant piece of real estate, and it's fascinating. But you do have a lot of plains. You get out into Manitoba, Saskatchewan, obviously Southern Ontario, a lot of plains in the area. So it is, how you feel about that. But it's a fascinating country. I would highly suggest that if you do want to do that, take the time, and I'll give you some resources at the end to really get a little bit of understanding of the history of Canada. And I think will kind of increase your appreciation of going across that country. It's an interesting place. People kind of say it's like, people do call it the 51st state. It's like the United States. And we do have a lot of shared history. I'll kind of go into that. I'm going to do a presentation hopefully next year. It talks about Quebec and Montreal and a lot of the founding of Canada. I do stuff. I'm a volunteer at the Minuteman National Park, and there's a lot in early American history where, Canadians' history is very intertwined. Obviously, a lot of loyalists end up going to Nova Scotia. We have, invasions coming from Canada. Burgoyne, who ends up at the Battle of Saratoga, comes down from Canada. So a lot of intertwined history, but it is a very, very different origin than the United States, and it was created without a war, which is kind of interesting for a relatively large country. It becomes peacefully a dominion in 1867, becomes a wholly independent country in 1932, and there are no cataclysmic wars, which is actually a nice example. So Yoho we'll go into. It's a little bit west of Banff and Jasper. Like I mentioned, it's actually in British Columbia. So it's in a different time zone. Not that that really mattered. We were there for one day. Went to the park visitor center, the park ranger there. Yoho is really known more for a lot of hikes. There aren't a lot of iconic things like Lake Louise or something like that, but there are a couple. There's Emerald Lake and there's Tekaka Falls. That's kind of where we concentrated our trip to Yoho. Like I said, it was just one day. And we actually went to Emerald Lake first, and we'll talk about that, but we had to end up and basically kind of reschedule our whole thing and go to Tekaka Falls, which is the second highest waterfall in Canada. And this is the only waterfall I'll talk about specifically. It is pretty amazing. It says 1,200 feet tall. Not even a hike. It's a walk from the parking lot to get to this place. It's got the roar, which unfortunately I have a video which shows that, but I can't share the sound. So take it from me. It does have quite a nice roar to it. You can get fairly close with all the spray, and then this outflow of the waterfall ends up in this river and goes down this way. You end up with this kind of Game of Thrones picture here, which is pretty amazing. So once again, just amazing vistas there. And because of the mountains and the clouds and everything else, you get a lot. And it's a great place for black and white photography. If you're into that and you're into the clouds, as I kind of am, get yourself a darkened sky. I didn't use a polarizer for most of these, but you get a pretty darkened sky anyway, and it makes for some really, really compelling pictures. But Tekaka Falls is definitely worth it. And I said there's probably 4 or 5. I'll point them out in the maps as to where the waterfalls are. And this is really the only high one you get. Most of them are just really high volume, and they're all very easy to get to. And we'll talk about a decision point we had to make of going to another falls or opting for something different. So Emerald Lake is the other kind of iconic thing within Yoho National Park. It is a very green lake, hence the name. The thing about Emerald Lake that we read, one of the big things to do in Emerald Lake is to canoe, and you can rent canoes there. Our research had told us be there by 10 a.m. And much to my daughter's consternation, we didn't get there till 10:15. And our research was correct. All of the canoes were rented, and of course the canoes rent for a minimum of 1 hour. So at that point, you're kind of stuck and having to wait around till somebody returns the canoe. So we pivoted, went to Tekaka Falls. So we'll go to Tekaka Falls. We'll come back to Emerald Lake, and then we'll see what the canoe situation is. And the one time in the trip, the weather played to our advantage because when we came back to Emerald Lake, it rained. It means we had to eat our picnic lunch in the car, but it meant everybody returned their canoes. So once the rain started to slow down and get close to stopping, we got out of our car and walked down to the canoe rental place, and there were plenty of canoes to walk up and rent. And there was supposed, the storm coming within another hour to 90 minutes. So we decided to pull the trigger and rent the canoe. And storm never came. You're in the mountains, very difficult to predict the weather. The gentleman who runs us canoes was very obliging. He was telling us, you really don't know. They come over the mountains, they can dissipate, they can get intense. Fortunately for us, it broke. We had some amazing vistas and had a nice hour canoeing on Emerald Lake, which I would highly recommend. Very calm, not a big lake, but you get in and you see these things. And we have a video that actually my wife took of, this green is green. It's not like, when you're from the shore, you see it's green, you get up close and it becomes, kind of a murky color or something different. It is green through and through. So this is a video that she took, and you see, we're canoeing. I'm steering the boat, which is kind of why the video I took didn't come out nearly as good as hers. But you were just in this, green water, and you're right in it, and it is just absolutely emerald green, and it's just kind of amazing. It does seem like somebody, did a Chicago River at St. Patrick's Day thing and just poured a bunch of food coloring in it, and there you have it. And the one thing I said, I did put my hand in Emerald Lake, and you do kind of have a film to your hand because there is a lot of sediment in there. But once again, it's just an amazing experience, and certainly being on it in a canoe was well worth it. And I'm very happy that the weather worked out and all of our logistics worked out. They were able to canoe on Emerald Lake. Highly recommend. So that takes us into Yoho. A question about Kootenai. We did not get to Kootenai. That's kind of just really like, I guess, 5 national parks in that area. There's Jasper, there's Banff, there's Yoho, there's Kootenai, and there's a glacier national park, not to be confused with the United States Glacier National Park in northern Montana. As you'll see, this was about, I think, a 9-day, I want to say 10-night, 9-day trip that we did. And, I'm not showing everything, and it's just unbelievably amount of stuff to do. So we, did not go to Kootenai. And once again, if you want to go back, there's so much stuff to do out there, and it really is just an incredibly dynamic and visually arresting place, which I will get into as to the most extreme of that is the Icefields Parkway. And so the Icefields Parkway is supposedly one of the 5 most beautiful roads in the world. And I certainly, in my experience, can't think of any road that even comes close to it. I have to shout out to my dentist, Dr. McPartland, who, when I was talking about this, he suggested we go north rather than go south to the United States Glacier. And you go on the Icefields Parkway, and it is unbelievable. So it goes basically kind of from Lake Louise up to Lake Louise here, up to Jasper. It's actually, it's Route 93. And it goes through, pretty much the gut of Banff and to Jasper. And you go through this. It's a very, I'll show a picture of it in a second. It's a well-paved, well-maintained road. It's 2 lanes wide, has a nice shoulder as opposed to the ring road in Iceland, which is a nicely paved road, but doesn't really have much of a shoulder, which can make things interesting. So it's an incredible place. And this thing really shows you, this photo shows you what you're dealing with here as this road winds through this valley, and literally on both sides, the left and right. And we drove it down and we drove it back. We drove it up and we drove it back. We drove it up. It was cloudy and rainy, so we didn't get as much of a vista as maybe we would have liked to. On the way back, it was perfectly sunny, so it was great to be able to do it on the way back. We originally thought about flying out of Edmonton because Edmonton is about a 4-hour drive from Jasper. So some people fly into Calgary, drive up to Jasper, fly out of Edmonton. We found out, A, it's more expensive to do that, and B, driving the Icefields Parkway twice is certainly not redundant. Like I said, most roads, when you drive it one way versus the other, you get different vistas, and that certainly is the case with the Icefields Parkway. Unbelievable. So what defines the Icefields Parkway, why it's called the Icefields Parkway, are glaciers. As our friend Mark Twain is never at a loss for a good quote, a man who keeps company with glaciers comes to feel tolerably insignificant by and by. And that is certainly true. So the Columbia Icefield is what you're dealing with here. That gives the name to the Icefields Parkway. This is the parkway here, 93, that cuts to the east of it. This is the one you can see right from 93. And we'll talk a little bit more about this as we take a hike up to get a gander at this. But once again, it's right here on the Alberta-British Columbia border. This Columbia Icefield, actually, the melt from these glaciers feed rivers that go to the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the Arctic. And we'll talk more specifically about the Athabasca River, which does go to the Arctic, because we were able to take a raft tour on that. But this is a pretty interesting glacier, and you think about, it's kind of on the Continental Divide, and stuff to the east ends up eventually making its way probably through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic. Stuff in the Pacific goes probably to the Columbia River, ends up in the Pacific, and then stuff in the north ends up in the Athabasca and ends up in the Mackenzie River, and then ends up in the Arctic. So for somebody from the Northeast, being in places where the water ends up in the Arctic is kind of cool. So This is the actually let me go back. Which glacier is this? This is the Athabasca Glacier. So this is the big one that you can see, and we'll talk about the ride you can go on this. But this is the glacier today, and Lisa's standing here at a sign that says in 1844, this is where the glacier was. So you can see there's been quite a lot of receding here. So this thing is melting. Not sure when, like Glacier National Park, they say down in Montana is not going to be around for, I think it's like 20 to 50 years. It's going to be gone. These, I think, are bigger glaciers, but it has receded quite a bit in the 200 years since 1844. This is something we didn't do, but there's a parking area right here by the Athabasca Glacier. It was mobbed. It's great because there's restrooms, there's facilities, all that kind of stuff. But also, it's the starting off point for these tours. And one of the big tour is you go on this Jagunda vehicle here and you drive up to the glacier. And then further up the road as part of your ticket, which is about $110, I think, you end up with this cantilevered overlook, which is becoming all the rage. They have one of these in the Grand Canyon now. I know they have, glass floor stuff in New York City for observation desk, stuff like that. Not a huge fan of this. And I'll say we didn't do this. And my flip comment is I was not going to, as a person from upstate New York, I was not going to pay $110 to stand on ice and snow. I think I've done my share of that. But that being said, I think we couldn't even get a ticket we wanted. It was absolutely sold out. Tons of people are going to this. The parking lot was mobbed. So it's a huge attraction right about halfway on the Icefields Parkway, but this is the big attraction on the Icefields Parkway. So this is the Icefields Parkway. You see, it's about 140 miles long, about a 4-hour drive if you don't stop. If you don't stop, you shouldn't drive the Icefield Parkway because it is an amazing stuff to stop at. And we did stop at the Athabasca Glacier. We did stop at some Wapta Falls, Athabasca Falls. We stopped on the way back. And we stopped at a place called Parker Ridge, which probably isn't as well known as many other stuff. Like I said, everybody goes to the Athabasca Glacier. They sign up, pay their $110, get their, get their feet on the glacier, do their cantilevered overlook and stuff like that. But my daughter was planning this out, and we had one of our last hikes, maybe actually our last hike, and there were two choices: either go to Parker Ridge, which you can see some glaciers, or go to another hike, which is going to show us another waterfall. My wife voted for the waterfall. My daughter voted for Parker Ridge. I cast a deciding vote, and I said Parker Ridge. Don't want to pat myself on the back too much, but the best decision I made on the whole trip. This is an amazing place. So Parker Ridge, you do have a parking lot here. This is a photo. Obviously, it was not this much snow when we were there, but it's about an hour and a half one way. So it's, 2.5 hours probably round trip. If you want to spend some time up there getting some amazing vistas. The way down is probably quicker. My legs were jelly at that point, so I'm not sure exactly how quickly it was, but it's doable. I think it's a moderate hike. It's not nothing. You're going up, you got switchbacks, you're getting some pretty good elevation. You'll see some of the photos that how steep some of the landscape is. But if it's within your purview, this is unbelievable, well worth it. Probably my biggest recommendation for the trip. So you're right here with the snow people. There were some people who were playing on the snow. If you want to get your jollies by, walking on snow and that stuff, you have access to it here. You can see the vistas as you look back here. This is the Icefields Parkway as it goes back in this valley and the amazing, peaks you have. Obviously, it was a pretty day with some good clouds, but it's pretty steep. And this is the kind of grand vista. I would say, and I don't think this photograph really does it justice. I did play a bit with it. It's in black and white, but I brought the color up in the lake. Probably one of the most unbelievable vistas I've ever seen. It is just incredible. You're standing up on this ridge, you're overlooking the valley. This is the Saskatchewan glacier, I believe, and the runoff going down into the lake, and then the lake goes off into a river, which continues down to the left here. Just amazing, a canyon here. Incredible, incredible vista. This is kind of like a Parks Canada advertisement. My daughter overlooking that vista. It's not when you're up here. The trail goes to the left there. It does peter out and gets a little funky where there's just not a lot great footing. So we decided discretion was a better part of valor, and it made sense to not really go down too far past that. But with these views, I felt we'd got our money's worth. And then you see some of these things are coming up and just how steep this is. And you see a lot of the runoff and the erosion that's going off. You see a lot of that within the Rockies, all these mountains. You see it along here too, that, all this stuff is being fed by the glacial runoff, but you also have the sediment coming down from this side of the mountain too. So a lot of these minerals are coming into the lake and mixing up and making these incredible hues that you see. And the other thing that we did is Pedo Lake, which is, I believe, on the Banff end of the Athabasca, or excuse me, of the Icefields Parkway. Another amazing lake, pretty easy walk. It is all paved. You have a little bit of a kind of up and down, but we were there on the way up and on the way back. On the way back, we were there on Canada Day. I said everybody's wearing their T-shirts with Canadian flags, and the place was absolutely mobbed. And there is an overlook. There wasn't really a trail to go down there, but once again, it's one of these glacial-fed lakes with some incredible colors to it. You had this kind of, we didn't really notice this until after we got home and looked at our pictures, but you kind of have a fox head here that's looking at this lake. And so you kind of had this nice vanishing point off into the valley. This is another black and white I kind of played with and brought up the colors while keeping the black and white and having some of the crepuscular rays coming through from the sun. But, very easy walk slash quasi hike from the parking lot and a very, very stunning overview. So that is the Icefields Parkway. Lisa, do we have any other questions I need to kind of field here?
No, I don't think so right now.
Okay, so now we'll go to Jasper, which is a little less known. Most people get to Banff, everybody knows Lake Louise, but Jasper itself is a little more mellow, less crowded. The interesting thing is we went to these places in Banff. Pretty much everybody we interfaced with, the servers, even people working at the national parks, they were all Australian. So a huge Aussie contingent has made their way to Banff in particular in the lower Rockies, Canadian Rockies. And we got into a discussion with one woman at the Banff Springs Hotel. We did have dinner there. And, she's saying it's kind of a cool place. They don't have, that kind of winter stuff in Australia. A lot of the people who work there, they obviously have other jobs in the winter. A lot of people work ski patrol. The gentleman who was our river guide, I'll get a little bit into his story, which is really interesting. But since the winter is is the biggest season there, your winter job is your big one. So if you're really into winter, into skiing, that kind of stuff, that's a place to be. But it was just kind of interesting. We didn't run into many Aussies in Jasper as we did down at Banff. At Banff, it was really like everybody, all our waiters, everybody was Australian. So Jasper is the town of Jasper is up here. It's much smaller than Banff, about 5,000 people. Not really that big a place, about 2 main streets, and that's it. As I said, the Icefields Parkway kind of goes up here and ends at Jasper. And the Moline Lake and the Moline Canyon is a big place that will end up for a couple of different trips, and we'll get to those in a second. There are some hikes around there, Pyramid Mountain being one of the prominent locations there. Edith Cavell is a very famous mountain there that has a very dramatic, almost Matterhorn type look. Very interesting place, very different vibe than Banff. Much more mellow, much more serious hiking, serious outdoor stuff. Very interesting area. And animals. And we did go on an animal from late afternoon to early evening animal tour in Jasper. One thing's interesting around there, when you take, this is actually in the Trans-Canada Highway, they have these animal bridges that happen every 5 to 10 miles, a lot of them. And they allow, the animals, and we'll see, there's a lot, you have moose, you have deer, you have elk, grizzly bear, black bear, all kinds of stuff. So they have built, and actually along the Trans-Canada Highway, there is a very, very well-maintained fence on both sides of the road to really stop, and this is obviously a big issue in these places, from particularly deer and elk jumping out in the road and causing all kinds of horrific accidents, and not ending up well for the animals either. So they maintain these fences, and they have these animal bridges that go out throughout the Trans-Canada Highway. So it's pretty cool. But one thing you must talk about is bear spray. So you really can't go hiking anywhere in the Canadian Rockies without bear spray. Everybody will say you have to have bear spray, and you cannot transport bear spray via airplane, either checked or on your person. So you have to buy it there and you have to leave it there. And one of the places you buy it is a store I was not familiar with called Canadian Tire. And Canadian Tire sells a lot more than tire. And Canadian Tire is the company that bought the intellectual property of the Hudson Bay Company back in the early part of this year. So I guess any kind of branded Hudson Bay stuff is going to be manifesting in Canadian Tire. And they sell bear spray. And it's about, I think it was like $75 Canadian, which is about $50 US. And there's different kinds of bear sprays to how far it shoots and stuff like that. And it only lasts for, I think it was 5 seconds. So there's this whole thing about bear spray, bring it with you. They talk about, having bells on your backpacks to warn the bears. We had learned from other, I think, reputable sources that does nothing, since a bear doesn't really know what a bell is. So it doesn't really pay much attention to it or is just scared of it. But make noise, clap. And if you're in a situation, that you feel like you can't get out of, where a bear is threatening you, you deploy this bear spray. Fortunately, I never really talked to anybody who had to do that. I made kind of a joke to the ranger that I returned the bear spray to. I said, this is kind of a little bit of a nice gig here where you can, we buy these things for $75. We give them to you unused, and you turn around. And I guess I didn't realize this until after I returned it. They turn around and sell them or use them. I think they sell them for like 20 or $30. But everybody, every ranger or person we talked to had some kind of bear story, but nobody had to deploy the spray. The spray is very toxic, and you don't want to be downwind when you spray it. So I don't know that, when the bear is going to charge you, whether the bear thinks if it's downwind or not. So a little unsure as to how effective it's going to be. Supposedly it's more effective than a gun. The one thing that we did learn, a little interesting tidbit, is it does not work on polar bears, because polar bears are the one bear species that can close their nostrils. So there are no polar bears in the Canadian Rockies, fortunately, and polar bear is a very serious animal. This is one of the interesting animals in North America that will actually hunt humans, but bear spray will not protect you. So you have to walk around with your bear spray. That's just part of the deal of going there. But ironically enough, 93% of the negative human-animal interactions are not with bears, they're with elk, and most notably the female elk. And so when we were there at the end of June, early July, it was calving season. The babies have been born. Mama elk is hiding them sometimes in the brush away from grizzly bears. Sometimes unbeknownst to people, they get between the hidden calves and the mama elk, and mama elk is not happy about that. We got fairly close to mama elk. Mama elk is extremely large. And our tour guide, Josh, shout out to our intrepid tour guide, Josh, he said that they will basically knock you down and stomp you. So it's a very unpleasant experience to get attacked by an elk. So that was kind of ironic. All the focus is on bear spray, but if you're really going to use something, you're probably going to use it on elk. We did see some bald eagles. This is a bald eagle nest. You can see through the trees here because of the fire, and we'll get into that in a second. That is a big, big thing in Jasper. They had a monumental wildfire back in July of last year, and this is supposedly the size of like a mobile home, or not mobile home, a RV. But we were so far away, and this has been going, I want to say it was 50 years that this nest has been occupied by bald eagles, and the bald eagles were basically kind of own this lake, and they've been nesting there for decades. I guess they have kind of a interesting um, relationship with osprey, where osprey are better fishermen than bald eagles, and so sometimes the bald eagles will actually the osprey will pay tribute to the bald eagle and like give them a fish, and the bald eagles don't really don't bother the osprey. But other than that, bald eagles are very aggressive in keeping their territory, and so you had access to this, and it was pretty interesting to see when it flew off when we were looking at it in late afternoon, early evening. You have moose. So we saw a couple of moose. We saw a marmot. This was actually on the Icefields Parkway. And in Jasper, we saw a mule deer. Credit to Josh, he tried as hard as he could to have us find a grizzly. We had seen a black bear in the woods on our own a few days before. We were not able to see a grizzly. However, this is literally a picture from my backyard last month. So I live in Chelmsford, and we do have black bear. And so one late afternoon, my daughter was downstairs exercising. We have a window in the basement, and all of a sudden she saw a black bear walk by. And so I was able to run out and take a picture. Unfortunately, I slammed the screen door, which scared the black bear. But this is the best picture I got of a bear throughout the summer. I did not get anything close to this in the Canadian Rockies. So Moline Lake and Moline Canyon is one of the famous things in Jasper. There is a boat tour you take on Moline Lake. And it's, I said, one of the iconic things, the Moline Canyon, which you go down from Jasper to Moline Lake, that is one of the areas they look for wildlife in. So when we took the wildlife tour, we actually retraced a lot of our steps going to the Moline Canyon, because that is a very, very popular area for wildlife. And so some of the wildlife we saw was on Moline Lake, Moline Canyon. And Moline Canyon this is the iconic picture of Moline Canyon. This is called Spirit Island. It is a sacred place to the native people. And it's an iconic picture. This is kind of one of your iconic pictures of the Canadian Rockies. Fortunately, Mother Nature was kind of good to me, although at the beginning I was not happy. It was actually actively raining when we got on the boat, and I was thinking I wasn't getting pictures at all because it was raining, but the rain subsided and we had this picture. These are the kind of boats that they run for Moline Lake. They are covered. When you get on the boat, if you have any bear spray, you must give it to the ranger, because they had an incident earlier in the year where somebody's bear spray discharged. And since this is a covered area, everybody on the boat got their eyes burned by the bear spray. And that was not in a thing they wanted to have repeated ever again. So the bear sprays, everybody's carrying bear spray. This is interesting. They'll sell you a holster for like $25, but you watch, and because everybody's paying attention, everybody's got bear spray. But when it deploys, one of the kind of ironic things about bear spray is once it settles, it's actually an attractant. It's pepper. So, it settles, so it becomes an attractant to bears. And also when you fire it off, it gets on your hands. Once again, it's incredibly toxic, burn your eyes, all that kind of stuff. So you have to rinse your hands off if you actually do deploy bear spray. So it's pretty complicated, but literally everybody who's hiking is carrying bear spray. So that was kind of a interesting story that I'm glad we were not able to experience firsthand, but it is an amazing place. And once again, you have this kind of greenish blue water, and you've got an amazing atmosphere, and you got this kind of iconic island here. It's just a beautiful, beautiful place. And as I mentioned before, the Athabasca River goes through Jasper. It goes through here to cleverly titled Lake Athabasca, and then it continues on to Great Slave Lake. And from here, this becomes the Mackenzie River. And the Mackenzie River enters into the Arctic Ocean, and the Mackenzie River is the largest river in Canada. If you're ever interested, there's a gentleman named Adam Schultz. He wrote a book about canoeing in the northern part of Canada, and he canoes the Mackenzie River upstream for a relatively long period of time. Crazy book if you're into that kind of outdoor stuff. He's I guess pretty well known in Canada, has done some videos, documentaries about his exploits. His name is Adam Schultz. I actually wrote a book about 10 maps that explain Canada. I'll mention that in my resources too. So the Athabasca River originates in the glaciers off the Icefields Parkway and goes down to Lake Athabasca. And you can take a river raft down it. We did that with our intrepid river guide, Mark, who was a wealth of information explaining all kinds of different things, not least of which the Jasper fire that I'll get into in a second. These people were working last summer, so they experienced all that terror firsthand, which was just a fascinating story to hear. And they take us a few miles down the Athabasca in the water. We're not paddling. This was, pretty tame stuff. You get splashed a little bit, but nothing too bad. That's a picture they take just before we land. This is a family from Edmonton. And this guy he talked about getting charged by a grizzly bear. And one of the things they say when you're charged by a grizzly bear is don't run. So he asked this guy what happened when you got charged by a grizzly bear. He's like, what do you think I did? I ran. So they were a pretty interesting family. They were serious outdoors people. When I asked him how it felt like to be at 40 below zero in Edmonton last year, he's like, I don't remember that. So I think I would remember if I was in 40-degree below weather. But it was pretty cool going on the Athabasca in this big thing. And Mark was telling us all about because his job is in the winter, he is a ski patrol, but he is also a avalanche technician. So part of his job is to go out, I guess, almost daily and analyze the density of the snow to see if there's going to be an avalanche or not. And one thing they will do to preemptively precipitate a avalanche is throw an explosive, basically a grenade type thing, further up to start the avalanche. So that is not your typical winter job. And some of the places we hiked, you would see signs that said, beware of unexploded devices. And I knew what they were talking about after I've heard Mark tell his stories about being an avalanche technician as a summer job, but that was pretty crazy. And this is my homage to the waterfalls that we saw. I said very dramatic. This is the Takakal waterfall, and I'll pan here as I go down the stream, and you end up, it says, too bad you can't hear the sound because you hear the roaring of the water. And as you pan here to the right, you end up with this incredible vista that I said kind of reminded me a bit of Iceland. You have the snow-covered mountain with the clouds going into it, and it's really quite a bucolic place. And you have these type of water rushing through the rocks, and obviously that has worn away the rocks. And it's very dramatic, high volume. Takakal is the only one that's really high. This is the Athabasca waterfall. Once again, you're there in the early summer, so the volume is very high because these glaciers are melting. They've been snow all year, and they have plenty of volume of water to run down these things, and it's just amazing. And this is how you end up at Takakal, as you can get pretty close to the end of it and get the spray from the waterfall. So the Jasper fire, this happened around late July of last year. It ended up taking about 1/3 of the town of Jasper. So this is basically the township of Jasper. The fire came from the south here and came up and got about 1/3 of the town. So it was an incredible impact. We didn't realize as we tried to make reservations, one of the reasons we couldn't get, there weren't a lot of things available is a lot of stuff had burned because there were a lot of lodges out here in the woods and those all got burned during the fire. So Mark was telling us the story of the fire is it was precipitated by lightning, although I guess there had been a beetle or some sort of insect that had weakened the trees. It had got behind the barks, the lodgepole pines are the huge pines that are kind of a monoculture there, which is not a great thing either. So you have all these pines, they were all compromised by the insect. The insect was killed off in the extreme cold, but the damage had been done. So these trees were susceptible. They had a lightning strike. They said, oh, the fire department can handle that. They had a second lightning strike. They said, well, hopefully the higher fire department can handle it. Third lightning strike, they were like, we're in trouble. Fire department can't handle that. So this all happened very quickly and they had to evacuate everybody. I'll get into some of the statistics in the next slide, but it was kind of next level. And so everybody who works up there, most of the people we talked to, they were there last year. They had had a bad winter because people had heard about the Jasper fire and thought Jasper was closed for business. So they did not have a good season in the winter. And they were really, they were very happy to see visitors there in the summer. So, there was 30% of the municipality's infrastructure, 320 square kilometers. Was the largest fire in Jasper National Park in over a century. 25,000 people, including the 5,000 residents. 1.3 billion, second most expensive wildfire disaster in Canada. And there were no tourist or resident deaths. One firefighter unfortunately did perish. And I think it's actually after the fire had gone through the area, but one of the trees was weakened, it fell, and actually fell on him. And that was obviously incredibly unfortunate. However, as you see, and understand how quickly this fire was and the fact they were able to evacuate these people with obviously not having a lot of training or practice evacuating, getting the people out of Jasper and not have them impacted by not having them, injured by this was pretty amazing. So it was quite an evacuation effort. Once again, everybody had gone through that, so that was an amazing story that they were, it was very fresh in their minds, and they were certainly, they one of the first restaurant we ate at, they said in the beginning beginning of the menu to be careful how you talk about it because some people still have a lot of trauma, some don't. The people that we were, particularly in the raft, the Jasper raft group, they were very willing to talk and open to talk about it. It was really interesting to hear their stories, and it was something else crazy. So you can see there's the residual, and once again, it was naturally occurring, unfortunately, the firefighter died. If that didn't happen, they were like, this is an amazing thing because this is, these are monocultures. The nature is for the fire to come in, basically burn this stuff down and have it regenerate. And you can see we were there a year later and stuff is starting to regenerate. These grasses are coming. We'll see some of the flowers in a future photo. They said, as far as the natural cycle goes, this is really, how it's supposed to work. But you see some of the impact. So this is right as you come into Jasper. This is right kind of where the fire ended, and right by a gas station there, and they still have the burned out gas tanks here, or gas pumps. And you still see this is, the basically temporary housing. You see a lot of these around. A lot of people are still living in this temporary housing even a year later. So it's going to take quite a while for them to build to kind of get back to where they were before the fire. Like I said, some of the flowers are starting to, come through, and you see some of the burns, and then you see in the background Pyramid Mountain. So you kind of have a juxtaposition there. This is a video that I took of around Lake Annette, which is a very nice flat walk, as you see from the path there, but it goes around the lake, and the fire did go up to one side of the lake, and you see all these burns. These are all lodgepole pines, which is the dominant species. Tons of those down by Banff. A lot of them around here as well, and they got burned up, and you'll see some of them are speckled, and speckling is where their sap was, and it got so hot that the sap pops and creates these speckles. So you see a lot of the trees here had these kind of speckled bark type of stuff, and that's from the basically exploding sap, which tells you how hot this fire burned. So it was pretty amazing impact. Pretty amazing impact. And they're worried about, when people hear fire, they're like, oh, should I still go to Jasper? Has it ruined everything? It's different. And like you said, it's a speckled thing right there. It is a, example of the natural processes that happen with these forests. And, it's going to regenerate, give a different tree than the lodgepole pine. But I found it kind of fascinating. In no way, shape, or form did it hinder our trip there. And the last hike we did was Old Fort Point, which goes up on the other side of the Athabasca River from Jasper. One of these short and steep hikes. As you can see, you kind of have to hike up this very steep hill. Once again, you see some of the flowers that are beginning to appear in the burned out areas. You get this vista over the Athabasca River. See the road going through here. And once again, these are all the forest that has burned out. You can see how it's, you can see right through and it's not thick and lush at all. And so it does go. I think this whole side of the mountain was burned. I mean, it was very, very large. Like I said, a very, very large area of fire that did burn. I believe what ended up stopping it burning, it didn't actually officially get put out till like April of this year, but the major part of it was a lot of it was Mother Nature. The winds turned and rain came, and that really kind of what saved, I guess, the 2/3 of Jasper that wasn't burned. Quick shout out to Pyramid Mountain that comes up. We did a hike on that, and this is like all over when you look around Jasper, you keep on seeing Pyramid Mountain. It's a great focal point for a subject as far as photography goes. It's beautiful. It's, reflected in the lake. You see it going through the Athabasca River. This is actually Lake Annette as well with the shadow of the pines. And we'll end up with art in the Canadian Rockies. Ansel Adams, one of his first actual forays as a photographer was going to this with the Sierra Club in 1928. He was a volunteer photographer, and he went into the Canadian Rockies and took a bunch of photographs. I mean, they were his first, so they're not as iconic as his later photographs go, but this was his early start into it. And there was a book published a few years back that gets into that. And as far as painting goes, Lauren Harris, who's one of the more famous Canadian painters, a member of the Group of Seven, which is also known as the Algonquin School of Modernist Painters in Canada in the 1920s to the early 1930s. They actually had a show of this. How I became aware of this was back at the 2016. The MFA had a show called The Idea of North, and it was the paintings of Lauren Harris. And basically the curator of that was Steve Martin. So the actor, comedian, Only Murders in the Building star, Steve Martin, is also a very big art aficionado. He's actually written books on art. He's a great art collector. Became enamored with the work of Lauren Harris and helped put together this show that went to the MFA Boston about 9 years ago. This is a kind of a blurry picture of Lauren Harris did hike into the Canadian Rockies, obviously, to get some vistas. And, this is hiking back in the 40s where it's not as easy as it is today. This is a type of painting that he was doing, this modernistic painting, kind of very similar mid-20th century, George O'Keeffe, that kind of stuff, Arthur Dove. This is one that was untitled, but it's Mountains Near Jasper from 1934. And that's it. This is some sources. There's not a ton of stuff. I had to kind of dig. When you go in the bookstores in both Banff and Jasper, I would highly recommend, if you like a book, buy it, because you get back to the United States and surprise, surprise, the United States is not great about stocking a lot of books on Canadian history, but a lot of recent stuff. There's this guy, Stephen Arbone, and he is making a career. And he wrote one book about the Hudson Bay Company, and then wrote a recent book about the Dominion, the Railway and Rise of Canada. One thing I will point out, if you're really interested in the Canadian history, there is a podcast called The Nations of Canada that started in 2020 by a gentleman named Greg Cobell. And it's about 250 episodes now. He's still doing it. I think I've listened to about 10 episodes because I was most interested in the early Canadian history. Very well done, very interesting. If you're interested in Canadian history, I suggest you check those out. And just ironically enough, if you're a hockey fan, the recently departed retired goalie of the Montreal Canadiens, Ken Dryden, a childhood hero of mine, he actually became a member of Parliament. He wrote a book in 2010 called Becoming Canada, which talks about the need for a national identity and things along those lines. So it's kind of ironic. Mr. Dryden just passed away a couple of weeks ago, a true polymath and Renaissance man. But if you're interested in some Canadian history, check that out. This is my photo to kind of encapsulate everything. When you talk about Majestic, the title of my presentation, this is the photo I would kind of hold up as that. As some of you mentioned in the beginning, yes, I'll be doing my next presentation in mid-January, switching gears on American history, and we'll be talking about John Brown. And we're going to go across 5 states, going to Kansas, going to New York, going to Connecticut, going to West Virginia, and going to Massachusetts, and kind of tracking John Brown while also taking some side trips and some of the more interesting travel areas you may not go to, particularly Kansas, which are really actually interesting places to go. And John Brown's story is very resonant today, very complicated, touches on a lot of different points in American history. And the one thing you can say how important John Brown is, there is no shortage of people who have written biographies of John Brown. It's astounding, all the various people who have written biographies of John Brown. So I highly encourage you to join me there in mid-January for that. And with that, I will say this is where you can locate Instagram, Facebook, although I may be changing my webpage soon. I'd love you to check out my photos, and we'll open up to questions. Lisa, we have.
Yes, a couple, Bruce. One, did we see any auroras? Someone asked that.
Do we see any what?
Northern Lights. Lights.
No. The thing I will say about it's kind of like Iceland. I mean, it's not as extreme as Iceland, but the sun was setting at 10 o'clock. And so the summertime is not a time to really see northern lights in places, certainly Iceland, where the sun is basically up for almost 24 hours a day. No northern lights that I was aware of up in Canada. Not that I was going to stay up till 2 in the morning anyway, because we had to get up early in the morning. But definitely the northern lights is something that's kind of the trade-off. The northern lights, you got to deal with more winter weather, which is very significant in Canada. If you're skiers, there's huge skiing, particularly in Lake Louise. But we did not see any northern lights. I'm not aware that they were going on at that time.
And another question was, do you know what people evacuated to? And I think that there were different towns. That's what Mark had told us.
Yeah, it's a good question because there aren't a lot up there. You're going, a couple hours north of Banff, so the populations aren't that great. And they did talk about the community up there. I don't know the specific names of the towns, but Mark did talk about these towns and people taking people in, kind of like the story that happened with Newfoundland and when they had to stop all the planes on 9/11 and all the people in Newfoundland took care of all these passengers. Very similar type of thing. And because there's a lot of community up there with all the different outdoor stuff that's going on, the different tours, the different hiking, all that stuff, they have a very, very tight-knit community. So they were very, very willing to take people. And once again, wildfires are a real fact of life up there, and you got to be aware of it. Got to be, once again, when it really hits, that is a shock, but it is something that is part of life up there. So they were certainly willing, and he said it was very heartwarming to see how the people did take them in and put them up for a while, because like I said, this fire did burn for a while, and a third of the town was destroyed.
Just another comment, Bruce. Someone would like us to include the source list when Jill sends out the follow-up, and also you could ask her. You could ask about that.
Good point. I'll do that. Yeah.
And just a lot of nice comments. Thank you, everyone, for everything you put in the chat box. I think we got to most questions. Very engaged audience.
Great. I appreciate it so much. Thanks everyone for attending. Hope you learned something. Hope it got you either interested in visiting or learning a bit more about it or appreciate it. And have a great night and hope to see you in January. Thank you.